Okay, so this is going to be Duskmourn House of Horror set review for the Timeless format. It's not going to be in any order of strength, so don't get the wrong idea here. And I'm only going to be going over some cards that may potentially see play in Timeless format and could also have some fringe plays as well that are a little bit janky but has some potential. So starting up, we have this card called Abhorrent Oculus. So I'm kind of hyped for this card. Currently, we don't have in Timeless any that matches the strength of Murktide Regent, and this is something that's pretty similar. 3 and a 5/5, pretty nice stat. Doesn't die to bolt, doesn't die to 3 damage. It's also flying, and at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, you also manifest a dread. This is a new mechanic where you can look at the top 2 cards from the deck, and you can put one onto the battlefield face down as a 2/2 creature, and you can also turn it face up anytime for its mana cost if it's a creature card. So it's a 3 mana 5/5 that constantly generates a 2/2 body at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep. So yes, it does die to Fatal Push unlike the Murktide Regent, but Murktide Regent also dies to a lot of removal spells in Timeless format, right? Especially Swords of Plowshare. So it's not like Murktide Regent is also not easily killable in Timeless format. And both of these cards kind of grow, right? Murktide Regent gets a +1/+1 counters, but this card keeps creating 2/2 bodies. They're kind of similar in vein, and both of them kind of does require you to exile some of the cards in the graveyard. In the Abhorrent Oculus case, you do have to exile 6 cards, which is quite a lot. So I see a little bit of a problem there. And if the graveyard hate does come down versus this kind of deck, which is the Mirror Tempo, which already does get hit by graveyard hate already because they played Nethergoyfs and Psychic Frog. So I'm still unsure whether this is actually that great in the deck, but it is still alluring, right? Since we don't have Murktide in the format. And the fact that this is a 3 mana, 1 blue means that you can mana drain into it a lot easier than Murktide Regent. So the fact that we have mana drain in the format makes Abhorrent Oculus a little bit better, but the fact that this is going to go into a deck that probably gets hit by the graveyard hate a lot, such as the Mirror Tempo, it might not be good, so it could also be a completely different deck as well. Like, for example, an Is It Tempo might want this card a little bit more, so we'll have to see. Okay, so next up is Shardmage's Rescue. So this is an interesting card, isn't it? So Boggles hasn't really been a thing in the Timeless format, but it has been a thing in Historic format. But it kind of fell off. But this might actually potentially bring it back, because a lot of the times, if you've ever played the Aura deck, you have a core Spirit Dancer, and then you bring something like a protection spell, but it's an instant speed spell, but it doesn't cantrip with the core Spirit Dancer since it's not an Aura. But this card, on the other hand, it is an enchantment Aura, so it is going to trigger the core Spirit Dancer, and it's also going to give you the hexproof that you need, and it has flash, and it also gives you +1/+1. This card is kind of insane. And another card that the Aura kind of lacked is the next card, Sheltered Ghost. So now the Aura has a way to give hexproof without having to go into instant speed spells and just play another Aura. But now you have a removal spell as an Aura as well. This one enters the battlefield. You can exile target non-land permanent an opponent controls until this card leaves the battlefield. But the creature that you enchant to also gets +1 and lifelink and War 2. What is going on here? This card actually kind of does it all. So this card can be used in so many different ways, right? Like you can use it as a removal spell, or you can use it as a way to pump your creature and potentially deal more damage. It's there to gain life. It's also there to put War 2 on a creature so that your opponent has a harder time dealing with. Like, especially if you're playing blue-white deck with a Spell Pierce, right? You have War 2 plus now you have a Spell Pierce. So yeah, I mean, this card just kind of does it all, right? Can't even get rid of the Leyline Binding. The card is pretty insane. But still not sure if the Aura is ever going to make a comeback. Just because I think what the Aura deck really lacks is a 1-drop. The 2-drops are really good. You have the Shram plus a Core Spirit Dancer, but you don't have any good 1-drops in my opinion. So we'll see. Alright, next up is Valgavoth, Terror Eater. So this card is pretty interesting, especially if you can get it out as early as possible. Because the earlier you get this card out, word cost that forces your opponent to sacrifice 3 non-land permanent is gonna hit harder, right? Which means after losing 9 life, you can recoup that life back because it has lifelink for some reason. And if a card that you didn't control would hit the graveyard, such as any of the instant speed spells, sorcery spells, even creature spells that your opponent plays will get exiled, which is really good because a lot of decks do rely on the cards going to the graveyard. So if you get this out, it's also a graveyard hate at the same time as something that's going to kill you in a few turns. So it's doing a lot of things that are powerful. And all the cards your opponent exiles, you can also play it on your turn. But it has to be your turn though, since it does say during your turn, you may cast cards exiled with this card. And it also says if you cast a spell this way, so you can't cast a land, so you can't play out a land, you can only cast a spell, pay life equal to its mana cost, rather than paying its mana value. So I mean, the effect is insane. Like, you're probably going to be playing cards like Grief in this deck, Thoughtseizes. So, like, let's say you have this card on the battlefield, you Thoughtseize an Omniscience, you can just play the Omniscience from the graveyard for 10 life. Like, this card is insane. And another perk with this card, right, because it has an insane word cost to sacrifice 3 non-land permanent, it's not weak to cards like Solitude. It's not weak to cards like Source of Plowshare. So let's say versus this card, if you had Aatroxa instead, you put an Aatroxa down, and then the Aatroxa gets exiled immediately. Compared to this card is going to see a few more turns attacking, and it's gonna get some value, especially if you have some discord spells as well. So I think this card is pretty promising. Definitely, I would like to try out some reanimate decks with this card. So we'll see how that turns out. And the next card is Overlord of the Balemurk. So I'm only going to be talking about 2 different Overlord cards from the set, and this is one of them. Now, I wouldn't generally put this card in here, but it does have some interesting effect with this other card named Up the Beanstalk. Impending 5. So this card has a new mechanic called Impending 5. It says if you cast a spell for its impending cost, it enters with 5 time counters and isn't a creature until the last is removed. At the beginning of your end step, remove a time counter from it. So notice that this card says it has if you cast the spell for its impending cost. So the impending mechanic makes you cast a card, but it's still going to be considered a 5 mana. So if you pair this up with something like Up the Beanstalk, it's going to trigger the Up the Beanstalk and you're going to draw a card. And when this card enters the battlefield or attacks, it's going to mill 4 cards. You may return a non-avatar creature card or a planeswalker card from the graveyard onto your hand. So I don't think the effect is too crazy, but if you're playing a deck that plays with the graveyard a little bit and it's a little bit more creature focused, I would say, I think this card might see play, but it's still too early to tell whether or not this is actually going to be that good. But I have it here because the impending cost amongst all the other Overlord cycle cards, this is the lowest cost amongst them. So I put it here just in case, since it has a pretty nice interaction with the Up the Beanstalk. And the next card is Overlord of the Hauntwoods. This is 3 mana impending. And again, this is also a card that's going to hit the Up the Beanstalk. And I think this card might have more potential if your deck is looking to ramp. So whenever this card enters or attacks, you create a tapped colorless land token named Everywhere that is every basic land type. So this effect where it creates a tapped colorless land token named Everywhere that is every basic land type kind of feels like an alchemy card. If you replace a create and then you put a conjure there, nobody would bat an eye. But it's a paper magic card that kind of does what the alchemy cards do. This is basically conjure. And this card is pretty interesting. It follows up very nicely from the turn you play Up the Beanstalk. and it does relevant things in a green color. You ramp, that's what the green wants. So there could be a deck that might actually want this. If your deck is playing something like Up the Beanstalk, bunch of impending cards, maybe a Fury as well, potentially there could be a deck like that. Next up is Razorkin Needlehead. So this card has a pretty decently high floor of this card dealing 3 damage every single turn. And the ceiling is that it punishes decks that play Brainstorm or cards like Treasure Cruise. So any decks that play Tamiyo, for instance, this card does a lot of damage. And because this card exists now you have to deal with this card plus a Bowmaster, maybe an Rakdos Shell. So it's not just Bowmaster now. And again, the floor is decently high. It has a first strike, so it's going to deal at least 3 damage every single turn, and also punishes the One Ring decks as well. Not the turn they play it, because it doesn't say they lose life, it says it deals damage. So the turn they play it, it's not going to deal damage because of the protection, but the following turns, if they do intend to draw additional cards, now they have to be wary of Razorkin Needlehead on the battlefield, plus potentially a flash from an Orcish Bowmaster as well. And again, because it also has a first strike, means that you also can't block this with Orcish Bowmaster ping plus the Orc Army token. Next up, another red card, Fear of Missing Out. If your deck already cares about Delirium, this card is an enchantment creature. So if your deck has a bunch of enchantment creatures, it's also going to help flipping that Delirium, right? But this is a card that loots a card. And what is a card that punishes looting a card? That is Orcish Bowmaster. But this card doesn't get hit by the Orcish Bowmaster that much, because even if an Orcish Bowmaster does come down, for some reason this card has 3 toughness. So Orcish Bowmaster ping isn't going to really work against this card since it doesn't have 2 toughness. And if you do have the Delirium, you're going to get an extra combat phase when this card attacks. Only once each turn, and you can also untap a target creature and you get an additional combat phase. So definitely an interesting card that you might want to try out. But the problem with this card is that there is a better card in the format in red color, and that is Impetuous Lootmonger, that I don't think this card is going to be able to replace. Yes, this other card has more toughness, and yes, it does give you that extra combat phase, but the Lootmonger, on the other hand, has a first strike, and it also gives you 3 different choices. So it's not just looting a card, it is looking at 3 different cards and then choosing your best option. Unless you really care about your own deck, the fact that the Lootmonger exists in this format, you don't really get that fear of missing this card out. So next card, we have another red card called Leyline of Resonance. And this card is kind of insane, especially if you're playing something like a Prowess deck, right? But the problem with this card is we don't really have much targeted spell that pumps a creature that also happens to be a 0-mana card, such as the Mutagenic Growth. And at the same time, it says it copies that spell when you target a single creature you control, which means if you have something like a Slickshot Show-Off, Slickshot Show-Off doesn't say that it gets a +2 by copying a spell, it's only when you cast it. So for this to actually work, you would have to have a creature that says Magecraft, such as the Clever Lumimancer. So I have my doubts about this card, even though the effect is insane. So we'll just leave it at that. And the next card is Say Its Name. So what do we have in Timeless format? We currently have a card called Malevolent Rumble in the format as well. So along with that card, plus this card called Say Its Name, now you might actually have an additional alternate win condition. So Say Its Name says you may return a creature or land from the graveyard to your hand. The land here means that you can also get back something like Shifting Woodland, which is nice. And once that resolves, exile this card and 2 other cards named Say Its Name from the graveyard. Search your graveyard, hand and or the deck for a card named Eltanok, the thrice called, and put it onto the battlefield. So let's look at the other card that it's going to put out, because that's pretty important for the viability of this card, and that is this card. This is a 7-mana 9/9 with a trample. I mean, hopefully a 7-mana 9/9 with a trample can win the game. So okay, so Say Its Name does already a thing that your deck wants to do, which is mill cards to your graveyard, but it also gives you a win condition that is a 9/9 trample. So it's probably a no-brainer that you're gonna see this card a lot in a lot of these shifting woodland decks, because I think this card is pretty insane. Because now you have an additional win condition that the deck didn't have before. What's cool about the Altanok is that if you have it in your hand, you can also discard this card to return a target land from the graveyard onto the battlefield tapped. So, and this is something that you can do on opponent's turn as well. And what's nice about that is, let's say you somehow milled a shifting woodland way early into the turns because you surveilled from it and you needed something different at the time. Well, now you can also go say its name or Malevolent Rumble, put the Altanok into your hand, and then you discard this card, get a shifting woodland back onto the battlefield tap, which is something the deck didn't have before. So again, pretty insane. So definitely these two cards you're gonna have to watch out for from the set. And the next card is Drag to the Roots. So if you're sick of playing the trophy, Assassin's Trophy, and then giving opponent a basic land, well, there's this new card called Drag to the Roots. If your Golgari deck can somehow get a Delirium pretty easily, this card is gonna be insane because this card also gets rid of any graveyard hates as well. So if your deck is playing something like Nethergoyf, Drag to the Roots can also get rid of Unlicensed Hearse, things like that. So I think this card is very, very good, but it is also a card that can feel a little bit clunky, especially if opponent's playing something like Leyline of the Void. So definitely a good card, but you're probably not going to be playing more than maybe 1 or 2 copies of it in the deck. So we'll have to see. I think this card is really good. And the next up is a Balustrade Wurm. It's a Fana 5/5. The spell can't be countered, and it has Trample and a Haste. Fana 5/5 that cannot be countered with the Trample Haste. I feel like that's decent. But that's really not why it's good here. But the fact that if this card is in the graveyard, you can return this card for 4 mana to the battlefield with a Finality counter on it if you have Delirium. So if you play it from your hand, it can't be countered. If you Delirium for 4, it can't be countered. And especially in a format now with Say Its Name plus Malevolent Rumble, I mean, getting that Delirium is not going to be hard. And especially if you Malevolent Rumble into this card, you can play this on turn 3 as well, if you do manage to get the Delirium. So I think this card is actually good. So at a glance, it doesn't look good, but I think it's actually pretty good. Could be a good sideboard card versus the Mirror Tempo, for instance, because it not only cannot be countered, but you do have to use 2 removal spells on this card if you play it from your hand. So I think this card has a lot of potential, but we'll have to see how that pans out once the cards are released. And the next card is Norin Swift Survivalist. I'm not 100% whether or not this is something that you're gonna see in the format, but it's a 1 mana card. This does have some interesting thing you can do with Unstable Amulet. Whenever a creature you control becomes blocked, so it doesn't have to be exactly this creature being blocked, and you may exile it, and you may play the card from the exile this turn. So along with Unstable Amulet, any card that you play from the exile also pings your opponent for 1. It doesn't technically have to be Norin attacking, it can be any card attacking. Plus, it's also going to deal additional damage if you do have the Unstable Amulet on the battlefield. But again, might be too cute. Probably the Ragavan's better, but if your deck does need more 1-drops and also plays Unstable Amulet, it could be a thing. So I just have it in here for now, since it does have some potential. And the next card is Kaito, the Bane of Nightmares. So I'm a big fan of ninjas. I played a lot of ninjas in historic format. I played some in timeless format as well. Not as good because a lot of the cards aren't buff like in historic. But with the Kaito, even in timeless, it actually you might have some potential being able to play some ninjas, because when you ninjutsu this card out, the card itself has hexproof, so your opponent's not going to be able to interact with this card. So you ninjutsu for 3, right, and attack, deal 3 damage, and you +1, you get an emblem with ninjas you control get +1/+1. And by the way, the Kaito itself is a ninja creature during your turn, so it is going to grow with every +1/+1. You do have to remember that, and I think that's what makes this card really, really good, since after a single uptick, you now have 5 loyalty, and it's a 4/5. And it does solve one of the ninja's huge problem that has always been the 1 toughness. Not to mention, the clock is going to increase significantly since it also gives you that +1 power as well. So I think this card is pretty slept on, and I'm definitely gonna try this card out in a ninja deck. And it's not like in Timeless format you can play Loris in a ninja deck as well, since unlike Historic, your ninjas aren't as good, so you do have to rely on some more expensive ninjas. And I would say the card has really good loyalty abilities as well, even besides the +1. Yeah, definitely a very interesting card, and I'm definitely gonna try this one out. And the next card is another Planeswalker. It used to be a Planeswalker, the Wandering Emperor, now the Rescuer. The 5 card with the 3/4 flash, with a Convoke, with a double strike, and other tapped creatures you control have hexproof. Notice that it says other tapped creatures you control have hexproof. I think that's pretty important. Usually with these Convoke cards, it would say the creatures you convoked with have hexproof or some garbage like that. It's always the one you convoked with that gets the benefit, but this here just says other tapped creatures you control have hexproof. So that's pretty relevant because a lot of these cards with convoke doesn't allow you to attack so that you can convoke this turn with your flash creatures. But this one, on the other hand, it just says other tapped creatures, so you can attack with all the cards that you want to attack with, and then convoke this card, potentially like convoking some creatures, right? If you don't have the mana. And then, well, all the creatures now have hexproof, and opponent has wasted a card on one of your relevant creature. So I think this card is really good. I feel like nobody really talks about it. And it's also really good versus Fury as well. Pretty simple card, very effective, also does a lot of damage by itself, right? It's a 6 damage per turn card. So yeah, I mean, if your deck goes wide very fast, I think this card is going to fit right in. So we'll just close it out there and talk about the next card. We have this card called Kona, Rescue Beastie. So before I talk about this card, I have a hot take. I think this card is a trap. I think a lot of people are eyeing on this card. Even me, when I first saw this card, I thought it was going to be good. But the more I think about it, I think this card actually might be a trap. So currently in Timeless, a deck where this card can fit into is a Shifting Woodland deck. Because naturally, if you tap the Shifting Woodland, copying the Kona, and then you also tap with the Shifting Woodland, and the Shifting Woodland is going to transform into Kona that is tapped. Problem with this play is that you're now turning into a creature that is easily interactable. And at the same time, the effect of the Kona only happens at the beginning of your second main phase. So you have to transform into Kona before the second main phase. I think that's the big problem here. It doesn't do it immediately. You have to wait until the combat phase, which is a huge problem in my opinion. Because if you look at the toughness of this card, it only has 3 toughness. The effect is pretty strong, right? The effect is pretty strong, letting you put a permanent card from your hand onto the battlefield, which can be Omniscience, which can be something like Godpharaoh's Gift, which we'll also talk about it later, which is another problem I see with this card. But again, it has 3 toughness, and 3 damage spells are so abundant in this format that it's crazy. Not even talking about the Fatal Push that has some stipulations in triggering the Revolt into getting this killed, which might be a little bit hard. If the Fatal Push was the only card we were worried about, then I would say this card is actually really good. But there's Solitude, there's Galvanic Discharge, Bolt, Swords of Plowshares, and that's not even naming the Fatal Push, right? So this card is super vulnerable in that regard. So there's my one issue with it. And the other issue is the fact that it's after combat. So what's a deck that really wants to get a card out before combat, and that is Godpharaoh's Gift. So the sneak and shift decks that really wants the combat phase to be important can't really abuse the Kona as well, since you can only put permanents onto the battlefield after the combat is over. That's why I say this card might be a trap, and the more I look at it, the worse it got. So that's my disappointment with this card, but I mean, who knows? Who knows? I might be wrong. I might be wrong. We'll have to see. The next card is Pyroclasm. Well, every red card is going to have 2 or 3 of these cards into the sideboards from now on, unless you're also playing a creature deck. So yeah, expect a lot of Pyroclasm because energy is on the loose. The next card is Maddening Hex. I think this card is a little bit janky, but I like this card. Enchant player. Whenever enchanted player casts non-creature spell, roll a dice. It deals damage to that player equal to the result. So if opponent doesn't play that many creatures and they're just spamming bunch of non-creature spells, that's where the Maddening Hex could shine. And yeah, I mean, the card could kill you within maybe even 2 triggers. Like if you took 6 damage twice, which is unlikely, but it could happen. I think the card is funny. Is it better than casting a Blood Moon on turn 3 when you're a red deck? I'm not sure. But it is certainly a card that could kill you depending on what kind of deck you're playing, so we'll see about that. Next card is Damnation. So this is a card that's coming as the special guest card. I've been asking for Damnation for quite a long time in Historic. Now that we have a Toxic Deluge, the card doesn't seem that good in my opinion, but if you don't want to lose life, I guess Damnation's your only choice. It's not a bad card by any means, right? It's not a bad card by any means. 4 mana, destroy all the creatures. That's still good, in my opinion. Especially in the black color, right? Because this kind of effect didn't exist in Timeless format before. Next up, we got Phantasmal Image. We already have a Mockingbird, but if your deck wants to copy bigger stuff, Phantasmal Image is going to be your choice. But in most cases, I think even tribal decks want Mockingbird instead of Phantasmal Image, just because Mockingbird is something that you can hit with Ranger Captivios, right? So Phantasmal Image, even though it's a pretty nice addition to the Timeless format, I don't really think you're gonna see much play, just because Mockingbird already exists, and I think Mockingbird's a lot better. So yeah, that is the entirety of Duskmourn House of Horror cards that I think could potentially see play in Timeless format. And amongst those cards, I'm most excited for Kaito. I'm excited for Say Its Name, plus the Altanok. And I'm excited for Valgavoth, Terror Eater. And I'm also most excited for the Abhorrent Oculus. So yeah, that is gonna be it for today's video. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys all in the next one. Bye-bye.